Thanks, Josh. It's really fascinating, and it's great to see that diversity and inclusion is being included on the agenda here because it's such an important topic, and I think it's one that's very easy to overlook. Just out of interest in the audience here, put your hand up if you've got the cool ticked off. None? No. So we've missed that boat. So I'm not going to talk about the youth, but I am going to talk about diversity and inclusion, and I'm going to focus on women because I've been asked to focus a little bit on women and how we bring them more into our various sports. But diversity and inclusion, I think it's really important to be very aware in your organisations. It isn't just gender. I think we're doing reasonably well comparatively on the gender aspect of things. We are not doing so well in other areas such as people of differing abilities, racial background, people from different ethnic backgrounds are finding it very difficult, I think, to find their way up the corporate or the board ladder still. It's a big issue for us in most sports. Young people, we really don't understand them. I'm going through this with my staff in my CEO role at the moment, actually trying to teach them what appropriate dress is and why. And so we're trying to not inhibit them in the way that they dress, but to make it appropriate, which is to not have your underpants label showing as you're walking around the office. They actually don't understand that, and it's become a bit harder in the post-COVID time as well to get people to actually understand what we're expecting as organisations. So I just want to make really very, very clear that when I talk about diversity and inclusion, I am not talking only about females, but I am actually just going to talk a little bit about women and what we've done in that space and what we need to do going forward in that space because I've been asked to focus a little bit on that. Interestingly, as David said, I was involved with harness racing Victoria. I was on their board for 6 years. I was the only female at any senior level in that organisation, at any senior level. We're talking other than administrative staff in the organisation. There was one female, and that female was on the board. It's not unique to your sector. I chaired a board that looked after shipping here in Victoria as well, and I was the only female in that organisation. I was the chair of the board. There wasn't another female in the organisation other than administrative level. So it is a big issue. It is changing slowly, but I think the process to go through changing all sorts of diversity means that you have to recognise what you are not. And I think this is a really difficult thing for organisations to do. We're very, very good at sitting there and saying we are whatever we think we are. We're diverse, we're inclusive, we're technologically savvy, we're up with the times. But it's a much more difficult task and a much more, I think, honest sort of task to sit there and actually say, what are we not? Because then you have to have a look at yourself and say, if we realise that we are not something, we have to take steps to change what we are not if we want to improve. And we have done this at Melbourne Football Club, for example. We are recognised as the oldest professional sporting club in the world, a club that had a constitutional structure. 163 years it took before I became the first female president of the Melbourne Football Club. I will point out we hadn't won a premiership for 57 years. I won one in my first year. So, so if you think that women aren't making a difference, then think again, because obviously that was all due to me. But being serious, the fact that we finally had a female president in our club didn't come through a deliberative decision to put a female into that role. It came through a process of me being the only female on the board at the time. We needed to make a change in our succession plan, or enact a succession plan, and my fellow directors said to me, it has to be you. You are the person just with the skill sets and the personality that we need for our club at the moment. It wasn't until after we had been through that process and I thought about what it meant to be a president of an AFL club, particularly as a female. And I would say that anytime you take on a role like this, you get to do fantastic things. I mean, here, those who are Victorian and understand what AFL is like in Victoria, I've sort of already been canonised in winning that premiership for Melbourne Football Club. It's held in such high regard, AFL here, it's quite extraordinary. But the process of going through selecting me or asking me to step up I actually said, let me think about it, because in saying yes to that, I say no to a lot of other things that I don't have time to do or don't have the opportunity to do, and I get great opportunities to do fantastic things in my role as a president of an AFL club. But one of the other things I really sat there and thought about is, now that I am elevated into such a public position and a position that is watched intensely here in Victoria as AFL is, it now becomes my responsibility to do something more about diversity and inclusion and to do something more about getting more females along this path. That's part of my job. And when I look at being a president of an AFL club, it is at least 50% of my job, if not more. And we have fabulous Raylene Castle, who had a much tougher gig than I did, because she was involved as the CEO of NRL. But I think as females, if you're not prepared to go in with that mindset of part of your job being bringing on others, part of your job being forging the way to make it easier for others to come through, then you really have to go back and reassess why you're doing what you're doing, because at the moment it still is a very big part of that diversity and inclusion process of, when you get there, you have to be responsible for bringing other people on. How does it happen? You can have some kind of internal, almost engenders process within your organisation where you just realise you get enough feeling in there that things have to change, and it sort of happens organically, almost. And I think that was what happened at our club. It was almost an organic change, an organic understanding that we just needed to be better. And the people who started to come to our club were people who wanted to be better. So if you're fortunate enough to have a culture and your leaders leading in that sort of space without fronting up and actually saying, we have to do this, you're in a fantastic position. But a lot of organisations aren't in that position. And in that situation, I think you then need to make a deliberative effort to make a change. And this is where I go back to that thing of looking at your organisation and saying, what are we not? And this is what Josh was just talking about. Are we not relevant to young people? And I know from harness racing, my experience there, we're not. In AFL, we're trying to be more relevant to more young people. We're trying to be more relevant to women as well, like most sports are. Are we relevant to people from diverse backgrounds? And we have a very diverse group of people in this room. We've just heard some fantastic speakers from other countries. So that's fantastic. But within your organisation is the diversity in your specific country in which you live as well, or is it a little bit of a closed shop still? So if you need to go through the process of deliberatively doing this, how do you actually undertake that task to make change? I think the first thing is that you have to actually understand what you're trying to do. I always say, too many times people start off with what we call a strategy. And I sort of say it's like inviting you over to my place for a drink after the conference. And a lot of you are not from Melbourne, I'm sure. And I'll say, I live in Yarraville. Come over for a drink. And that's it. Would you then start the process of trying to get in your car and just driving around in the hope that you might see Yarraville on a signpost somewhere, and further to that I might be standing in my front yard as you drive past? We don't do that. We actually say, where am I specifically going and how am I going to get there? But too often we start with a strategy and we sort of have an idea of what our goal is, but it's not clearly defined, no one else can understand it, and we don't actually have a plan of how to get there. So if you want to go down this path of increasing diversity and increasing inclusion, you have to actually have a clearly defined endpoint, a clearly defined strategy. What are we trying to do? And then you have a plan to get there. Once you've got that, you've got to get people to buy in to actually deliver on your plan. If you have a situation where you're asking people to change, asking people to be more diverse, you're asking people to be more inclusive, and they don't genuinely believe that they should be, or they don't genuinely believe in the strategy, it just is not going to happen. And that happens in a lot of organisations. It happens in situations where governments, for example, step in and say, you must do X, Y, Z. And we saw this with quotas here in Australia in particular, where it came in and said all government boards have to have 30% female representation on their board. Simple thing to do. If anyone in this room is struggling to find highly overqualified female directors to come onto any of their boards, come and see me. I have a list of at least 100 women who would more than capably fill those roles. But when it became a forced directive, it then became a pushback situation where people say there aren't women out there, they're not skilled enough, we're being forced to do it, and it became a very negative process. And we will see that with any sort of inclusion. It doesn't matter what it is. If you're forced to do it, then your immediate reaction is knee-jerk response, I don't want to. I'm being forced to do something I don't want to do. But when you buy into the strategy and when your whole organisation actually believes we are doing this because it's just the right thing to do. Diversity inclusion is a great thing. It brings different thinking. It brings different perceptions. You're not going to get very far with your digital and IT strategy if you don't have young people sitting in your organisation. And so many people now on boards are looking for young digital and IT experts to come and be part of their boards and governance structures. That's something entirely new. Usually you get onto a board when you're 65, you've retired and you've been around for a long time. So we're changing that process. So think to yourself, if you genuinely want to go down this diversity inclusion pathway, and we've done it, for example, at Melbourne Football Club with our Indigenous inclusion process. So we're on our third reconciliation action plan now, and that Indigenous inclusion is driven by the staff. So each year, last year I went to the Northern Territory, I hopped on a little light plane with our Premiership Cup and we took it out into community, places that you would not believe even exist. They are so remote. We took our cup out there. That was something that was driven entirely by the staff. They organised it. They asked me, would I go? When you get that kind of willingness in your organisation to include, then you do fantastic things. If you don't have that willingness, it's not going to happen. I was asked to talk about that very double-edged sword quotas and whether or not I believe in quotas. I do and I don't. I sit squarely on the fence in this, and I say I don't believe in them where they're not required, and I think in most situations I hope very soon to get to a place where we don't require quotas at all. A quota is a forced inclusion requirement, and people generally don't respond too well, as I said, to being forced. But I do think we need quotas in situations where there is deliberate bias to having more diversity and inclusion in your organisation. And we'll go back to that point of saying, think about what you are not as an organisation. If the first thing that springs to mind when you talk about having potentially a quota forced on your organisation, is your immediate reaction to that a negative one, or is it one that says, yeah, that's actually a good way to get us where we need to go? So in cases where there's deliberate bias, yes, I do think there is a very strong need for quotas, and I think quotas will serve a fabulous purpose in bringing greater inclusion and diversity, and not only that, bringing greater understanding of some of the myths and misconceptions that are out there, i.e. this misconception that there just aren't enough women out there who can take on board roles, that women who haven't played AFL, for example, and haven't won a premiership in the men's league can't coach a men's AFL team. We're starting to break down those biases, but it's taking a very long time. I don't think we need quotas in situations where there is no bias and there is a deliberate and well understood belief that inclusion and diversity is a good thing. You don't need a quota then, because people who are the best skilled people, have the best cultural fit, have the best attitudinal fit, people will then find their way into the right spots in the organisation. I would love to be in that place, because then it doesn't matter if you're male or female. Gender becomes completely irrelevant, as would race, as would any of the other ability, anything else. That would become irrelevant, because you're purely treated on your skill sets, your abilities and your cultural fit. I don't think there are many organisations that are close to that as yet. One of the areas that I do think we are doing quite well in is the board level, and you again can judge for yourself whether or not you think your particular organisation is doing well at the board level, and I'm talking in a corporate sense now, because we have had a situation, particularly here in Australia, where we've had recognition and we have had forced inclusion at the board level, and there are many women who are highly skilled executives who've gone through the company directors course, for example, here, and have those governance skill sets. I think we're doing quite well there. In many of the sports, and I would include racing in this from my experience at harness racing, obviously, I think coming through the executive levels, we're still struggling a little bit to get women up into those higher level executive roles. And again, I challenge your organisation to think about whether or not that's a deliberative thing, or whether or not you're not bringing enough people through, because I'm pretty certain that there would be enough women out there skilled enough to take on the executive roles. So again, it's that inclusion question. How inclusive are you being? How much are you trying as an organisation to actually deliver on greater inclusiveness and greater diversity within your organisation? I touched on a couple of things. I am a horse rider. I grew up on a farm. I don't really follow racing, and to some degree I have the same sort of feeling that a lot of other people feel, particularly not so much flat racing, the steeplechasing I don't really like, because I get the welfare element of it. And that's not casting any negative mindset on the racing industry. It's just something that I feel, and as I said, I grew up on a farm, riding horses, chasing sheep and cattle, doing bends and flags and barrel races and those sorts of things. So I'm wondering, and you may be able to answer this better than me, I'm wondering if this is a gender-related thing. I'm wondering if more females feel anti-gambling, if more females feel anti-horse welfare, and I say that in a negative way, anti-horse welfare, than males do. I'm not sure. It'd be really interesting to see some statistics on that, but Josh just spoke about it before. If it is, and I can see a nodding head there, so I suspect that notionally you just say yes. I think women, certainly gambling, I think we and it'd be interesting in other countries how you're going with regulation, but we here in Australia are heading to, or you are heading to a very, very, very steep cliff face, which is the cliff face that says it's become so socially unacceptable to gamble that you're going to really struggle in the gaming industry going forward. And I wonder how far away that is. I mean, think of that in your sector. Is it 10 years away? Is it 20 years away? It's changed so much regulation-wise since I was even in the sector 10 years ago. We've just moved out of the Melbourne Football Club, for example. We own 2 gaming venues. We just sold them both because we don't want to be associated with gaming. There's betting in AFL. I wonder how long that will last. So that's a real concern for you, and I think it's a real concern for women in general. So that's one issue I think you have to tackle more broadly, but particularly think about how it becomes a positive conversation, as Josh said, with women and with young people. Welfare with young people is very, very difficult issue for them to deal with, particularly when it comes to animals, I think. So there's some challenges for you in your sector. You have to make it as easy and as approachable as possible, your sector, and that's a difficult thing to do. When you go out and think to yourself, if you go out to a Christmas party, a New Year's party, a birthday party, and you say, I work in racing, what's the response that you get if you're not with a group of, if you're not at a conference like this, where you're with a group of racers? I can see all the women certainly nodding their head going, it is a difficult thing, because it's, you would be getting hammered, like the people, for example, who are doing roadworks in Melbourne, anyone who's tried to drive around, you would be getting hammered, I would think, on why are you in racing? It's unfair, it's da-da-da. You would get that. So how do you actually create an area for your conversations to be more positive, and how do you actually create that culture within your organisation for racing to be considered more acceptable for young people, for women, for people of diverse backgrounds, whether it's within the laneway or within the swim lane of actually working in an executive, being on a board, being a jockey, being a trainer. How do you actually create that comfort space for people from diverse backgrounds to be included in racing? I think that's one of your biggest challenges, along with all the others that Josh spoke about. So good luck for the next 10 to 15 years in the racing industry. I think there's some of your challenges that you really do have to deal with, because it'd be interesting to hear from Raylene about her thoughts on NRL, which I think is quite different from AFL in terms of the diversity and inclusion space as well. We're sort of moving along slowly, but I think for you as a sector and for you as individual groups in this room today, the question is, how quickly are you moving? Are you near those that are at the front of the pack? And can you actually take steps to get yourself ahead of the rest of the pack, as Josh said? You don't want to be in a situation where you're just trying to catch up, because I know we work hard on it at AFL, and we're going to try and keep going on and on ahead. So I think there's big challenges. I think there's huge opportunity because, as you would know, there's limited diverse inclusion, I would think, in racing, and it doesn't make sense because you don't discern what horses can and can't race usually based on whether they're mares or stallions or geldings or fillies or colts. Sometimes you do, but usually not at the higher end. We don't at the Olympics. Men and women compete evenly in dressage, in jumping and 3-day eventing because it's a horse and rider combination. Are they getting the same equal opportunity to be involved at other levels of your sport, be it on the field, off the field, at the board table, at the executive table, as they do on the field? Because in the fabulous words of the wonderful Michelle Payne, if you don't believe women can do it, you can all go and get stuffed.